The dust of the high desert settled like a shroud, a fine red powder coating the cracked leather of the stagecoach seats and the hems of their weary dresses. Leanne stood on the splintered boardwalk of Prosperity Gulch, her hand a steadying anchor on her mother's fragile arm. The light pink of her prairie dress, chosen with such care weeks ago in a world away, now seemed a foolish, fragile thing against the town's hard-bitten landscape of raw timber and unforgiving sun. Before them stood the mercantile, its sign proclaiming Finch's Provisions and Dry Goods in letters that were already peeling. And before the mercantile stood Alistair Finch himself, a man whose photograph had promised a kind, if not handsome, future. The man in the flesh was smaller, his face pinched with a sour disappointment that curdled the air around him. He looked from Leanne's hopeful face to the stooped, silver-haired figure of her mother, Aunt May, who leaned heavily on her daughter, her dark green traditional dress a stark, elegant contrast to the drabness of the town. Finch's lips, thin as a razor cut, tightened. He had paid for a bride, a worker, a healthy young woman to manage his home and stand behind his counter. He had not paid for an anchor. He had not paid for an elderly mother. He gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist, a motion that encompassed both women but landed with particular cruelty on Aunt May. This was not the arrangement, he said, his voice not loud but carrying a sharp metallic edge that cut through the afternoon stupor. The letter said you were coming alone. I have no room for excess. The word hung in the air, grotesque and heavy. Excess. A lifetime of love and sacrifice. Of stories whispered in a shared language. Of hands that had mended and cooked and soothed, all reduced to a merchant's term for unsellable inventory. Leanne felt the blood drain from her face, but her grip on her mother's arm did not waver. She would not let her mother feel the tremor that had started deep inside her. She would not let this small man see her fall apart. The moment stretched, thin and brittle. A few curious townsfolk had paused, their errands forgotten. The saloon doors swung open, spilling out a pair of dusty prospectors who stopped to watch the unfolding drama. Finch, sensing an audience, seemed to puff himself up, his indignation becoming a performance. He was a man of business, a pillar of this fledgling community, and he would not be made a fool of. He would not be cheated. I run a business, he announced, his voice rising to project to the growing crowd. Every nail, every sack of flour has its cost. I made an agreement for one, not for two. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Aunt May, who blinked slowly, understanding the tone if not the words. She understood the language of contempt. It was universal. The crowd began to murmur, the sound like dry leaves skittering across a hardpan. There were snickers, low and mean. A woman in a faded calico dress whispered something to her companion, her hand covering a smirk. They saw a spectacle, the strange, foreign woman in her silly pink dress and her even stranger, ancient mother, a pair of unwanted ghosts delivered to their doorstep. Leanne's spine straightened into a rod of unyielding steel. She could feel the stairs like physical blows, 100 tiny needles piercing her skin. She had traveled across an ocean, endured storms and sickness, holding on to the promise of a new life, a safe harbor for her mother in her twilight years. She had imagined a home. What she found was a pillory. She is my mother, Leanne said, her voice quiet but clear, each word a carefully chosen stone thrown against the wall of his cruelty. She would not beg, she would not plead. Her dignity was the only currency she had left, and she would not spend it here, on this man, in this place. Finch scoffed, a wet, ugly sound. And she is your responsibility, not mine. He turned his back on them then, a gesture of final, public dismissal, and began to address the crowd as if they were a jury. I'm a fair man, but this is a deception. The crowd, eager for a villain and a hero, and always ready to side with one of their own against an outsider, murmured its assent. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on Leanne's shoulders. The sun beat upon the dusty street, making the world shimmer and distort. From the edge of the town, where the raw, untamed wilderness began its slow crawl up the mountainside, a figure had been watching. He had been there when the stagecoach arrived, a silent observer leaning against the shaded wall of the blacksmith's forge, his presence as natural and unnoticed as a weathered boulder. He was a man of the mountains, a creature of shadow and stone who came to town only when necessity demanded it, his visits brief and silent. Jedediah was his name, though few in the town used it. They spoke of him in whispers, the Mountain Man, a figure of myth and rumor. He was immense, a giant carved from the very rock he called home. His chest and shoulders were a vast expanse of sun-darkened skin, crisscrossed with the pale lines of old scars, each one a story the town could only guess at. A thick, untamed beard and a cascade of long, dark hair framed a face that seemed to hold the patience of the ancient peaks themselves. He was shirtless, wearing only a pair of worn leather breeches, his bare feet dusty from the long walk down. He watched the scene unfold at the Mercantile, his eyes dark and deep-set, missing nothing. He saw the merchant's pinched face, the crowd's casual cruelty, the old woman's frail confusion, and the young woman's defiant, terrified pride. He saw her in her light pink dress, a wildflower attempting to bloom on barren ground. He saw the way she shielded her mother with her own body, a small, fierce act of love in a world that had shown them none. He remained still, a part of the scenery, until Finch turned his back, until the finality of the rejection settled over the two women like a death sentence. A profound stillness emanated from him, a silence that was not empty but full of weight and power. Then he pushed himself off the wall. The movement was slow, deliberate, a geological shifting rather than a man simply deciding to walk. He took a step, then another, his bare feet making no sound on the dusty ground. The crowd, so engrossed in Finch's self-righteous performance, did not see him coming at first. They felt him. It was a change in the air, a sudden drop in the temperature of their collective mockery. The snickers died in their throats. The whispers faltered. A space began to clear around him, an invisible parting of the waters. People shuffled back, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly agape. He was a force of nature that had wandered into their small, petty drama, and his presence dwarfed everything. Alistair Finch, his speech faltering, turned to see what had stolen his audience. His eyes landed on Jedediah, and the color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, doughy white. The mountain man was not looking at him. His gaze was fixed on Leanne and her mother. He walked without haste, his path a straight, unwavering line to the spot where the two women stood isolated and condemned. He stopped a few feet from them, the sun at his back casting a long protective shadow that enveloped them completely. For a moment he said nothing. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. The creak of a distant windmill was the only sound. He was a monument of quiet power, his silence more commanding than any shout. He looked at Leanne, his expression unreadable but devoid of the judgment and scorn she had faced all afternoon. He saw the tremor in her hands she tried so desperately to hide. He saw the unshed tears glittering in her dark eyes. He saw her courage. Then his gaze shifted to Aunt May, and a flicker of something softened the harsh lines of his face. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of respect to her age, her weariness. Finally, he turned his head, just enough to acknowledge the merchant cowering by his own storefront. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep within the earth. It was not loud, but it filled the sudden, absolute silence of the street. "My home," he said, the words measured and solid, "has room for both." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Alistair Finch looked as if he had been struck. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The mountain man's declaration was not a question, not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact, as undeniable as the mountains that loomed behind him. He had redrawn the world in 5 simple words. He had created a space where there was none. He then turned his full attention back to Leanne, ignoring the stunned townspeople and the sputtering merchant completely. He took a small step closer, his immense size making Leanne feel impossibly small, yet for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, not afraid. He extended a hand toward her. It was a large, calloused hand, the hand of a man who worked with rock and timber and earth. But the gesture was gentle, an offering, not a demand. Leanne stared at that hand, at the lifeline etched into his palm. It was a bridge away from the humiliation, away from the jeering faces and the crushing weight of rejection. It was a path. She looked up at his face, into his dark, steady eyes, and saw not pity, but a profound and simple recognition of her humanity. She made her choice. With a deep, shuddering breath, she placed her small hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, a circle of solid strength. Then, with his other hand, he reached out not to Leanne, but to her mother. He did not grab or pull. He simply offered his arm, a gesture of courtly support that seemed both shockingly out of place and perfectly right. Aunt May, who had been watching with wide, tired eyes, seemed to understand. She placed her frail, wrinkled hand on his powerful forearm. Jedediah nodded once, a final, silent confirmation. He then turned, and with Leanne on one side and her mother on the other, he began to walk away from the mercantile, away from the town, heading back toward the rising slopes of the mountains from which he had come, leaving Prosperity Gulch to drown in its own stunned, shamed silence. The walk away from the town was a silent procession. The gawking crowd, the sputtering merchant, the entire scene of their public shaming receded behind them, shrinking with every step until it was nothing more than a bad memory shimmering in the afternoon heat. Jedediah set a slow, deliberate pace, mindful of Aunt May's shorter, more hesitant steps. His presence was a shield, deflecting the world. Leanne walked beside him, her hand still loosely held in his, a connection that felt less like a restraint and more like an anchor in a churning sea. She kept stealing glances at him, at the rugged profile, the wild tangle of his hair and beard, the sheer, solid mass of him. He was nothing like the man in the photograph. Nothing like the future she had been promised. He was something else entirely, something wilder, older, and, in a way that defied all logic, safer. The path began to climb, leaving the flat, dusty plain behind. It wound through scrub brush and hardy pines, the air growing cooler, cleaner, scented with resin and damp earth. Jedediah moved through this world with an easy, silent grace, his bare feet finding purchase on rocks and roots as if he were a part of the landscape itself. He did not speak, and Leanne found she did not need him to. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant hawk, and the steady, rhythmic sound of their own breathing. It was a silence that healed. When Aunt May stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps, Jedediah stopped instantly. Without a word, he knelt down, his back to her. It took Leanne a moment to understand the invitation. She translated for her mother in a low, urgent whisper. Aunt May hesitated, her traditional sense of propriety warring with her exhaustion. But then she looked at the broad, unyielding back offered to her, a platform of pure strength, and she relented. Leanne helped her mother settle onto Jedediah's back, and he rose as if she weighed nothing at all, his stride barely altered. He carried her as gently as if she were a precious, sleeping child, his large hands supporting her legs with an almost reverent care. Leanne walked beside them, her heart a confusion of awe, gratitude, and a bewildering, burgeoning trust for this strange, silent giant who had claimed them from despair. They arrived at his home as the sun began to bleed its final, fiery colors across the sky. It was not a grand house, but a simple, sturdy cabin built from massive, hand-hewn logs, nestled in a small clearing and sheltered by ancient pines. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, suggesting a fire recently banked. It looked less like a building and more like something that had grown out of the mountainside. It looked permanent. It looked safe. Jedediah gently lowered Aunt May onto a rustic bench by the door, then pushed the heavy plank door open, ushering them inside. The interior was a single large room dominated by a great stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, the clean, simple scent of a life lived without pretense. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves holding a few tin plates and clay pots, and in the far corner a bed frame piled high with thick furs. It was a spare, masculine space, but it was meticulously clean. Every tool had its place, every surface was wiped down. It was the home of a man who valued order and solitude. Jedediah gestured toward the bed, the only one in the cabin. "For you," he said, his voice a low rumble, indicating both of them. He then pointed to a stack of clean-looking blankets near the hearth. "I will be here." He made it clear he would sleep on the floor, giving them the only comfort he possessed. Leanne felt a lump form in her throat. This stranger, this wild man of the mountains, had offered them more grace and honor in a few hours than Alistair Finch had in a lifetime of correspondence. Later, as Aunt May lay resting under the heavy furs, her breathing finally deep and even, she spoke to Leanne in their own tongue. She said that his eyes were not those of a savage, but of a sad king, that his hands, though rough, were kind. Leanne sat on the edge of the bed, watching Jedediah as he moved about the cabin, stoking the fire, his massive form casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He seemed utterly unaware of her gaze, lost in the familiar rituals of his solitary life, a life he had just willingly, irrevocably, altered for 2 strangers. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. A new kind of silence settled between them, different from the tense quiet of the journey. This was a comfortable silence, a language of shared space and mutual respect. Leanne rose with the sun, the high-altitude light spilling into the cabin in clean, sharp shafts. She would find Jedediah already gone, a stack of fresh firewood neatly piled by the door, a bucket of clear, cold water drawn from a nearby spring. While Aunt May rested, her strength slowly returning in the clean mountain air, Leanne claimed the cabin as her own domain. She swept the plank floors, tended the small, hardy vegetable patch she discovered behind the cabin, and learned to cook with the ingredients Jedediah provided. He would return in the late afternoon, often with a rabbit or a brace of birds, which he would clean and prepare with a practiced, no-nonsense efficiency before leaving them for her to cook. They ate their meals at the small table, the 3 of them, a strange and silent family. The communication was sparse, a mixture of gestures, single words, and the universal language of shared tasks. He learned her name, repeating it softly until the sound of it felt right in his mouth. Leanne. She learned his, Jedediah, a name that felt as solid and ancient as the mountains themselves. One afternoon he came back not with game, but with his hands cupped carefully together. He stopped before her where she was mending a tear in her mother's dress, and opened his hands. Inside lay a single, perfect wildflower, a splash of impossible blue against his calloused palm. It was a mountain columbine, a flower that grew only in the highest, most hidden places. He had climbed to find it, for her. He offered it without a word, his dark eyes holding hers. Leanne took it, her fingers brushing against his, a spark of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. She tucked the flower into her hair, and for the rest of the day she could feel its delicate weight, a silent, beautiful promise. Weeks turned into a month, and the sharp edges of their strange new life began to soften. Leanne no longer felt like a guest, but a partner in the quiet dance of their days. She found herself watching him more and more, noticing the small things, the way his brow furrowed in concentration when he sharpened a tool, the surprising gentleness in his hands as he tended a small wound on his arm, the way he would sometimes stand at the cabin door at dusk, looking out at the vast expanse of ridges and valleys as if in silent communion. Her fear had long since evaporated, replaced by a deep and abiding sense of security. Here, on this mountain, with this man, she was safe. Her mother was safe. Aunt May was thriving, her cheeks regaining some color, her steps growing steadier. She would sit in the sun, humming old songs, her presence a quiet blessing on the small homestead. The soft romance between Leanne and Jedediah grew not in grand declarations, but in small, incremental acts of care. He began leaving the wildflowers for her every few days, a splash of color on the rough-hewn table when she awoke. She began saving him the best portion of their evening meal, setting it aside to stay warm by the fire until he came in from his final chores. One evening, a summer storm rolled in, a violent, magnificent tempest that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Rain lashed against the roof, and wind howled through the pines. The world outside was chaos, but inside, the firelight cast a warm, golden glow, creating an island of peace. The storm trapped them together, the space in the cabin shrinking until it was filled with their shared presence. Aunt May was already asleep, oblivious to the thunder. Leanne was sitting by the hearth, patching one of Jedediah's shirts when he came to sit on the floor nearby, closer than he usually did. For a long time, they just listened to the storm. "You are not afraid," he stated, his voice a low counterpoint to the howling wind. "No," she answered softly, not looking up from her sewing. "Not here." He reached out then, his large hand covering hers, stilling her needle. His touch was warm, firm, and sent a jolt through her entire being. "Leanne," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He said nothing more, but he didn't need to. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. It was an answer, an acceptance, a beginning. The legend of the mountain man began to change in the valley below. Prosperity Gulch had been left with the bitter aftertaste of its own smallness. Alistair Finch's business began to suffer. People looked at him differently, seeing not a wronged businessman, but a petty tyrant whose cruelty had been laid bare by a single act of quiet nobility. Customers grew scarce, their errands taking them to other towns, their gazes sliding past his mercantile as if it were haunted. The story of that afternoon was told and retold, growing with each telling. They spoke of the giant, shirtless man who had descended from the peaks like a spirit of justice. They spoke of his voice, which had silenced a whole town without being raised. They spoke of the 2 foreign women he had sheltered, not as burdens, but as treasures he had claimed. The mockery that had once been directed at Leanne and Aunt May was now turned inward, a quiet, corrosive shame that settled over the community. Prospectors and trappers who ventured into the high country would sometimes return with stories. They spoke of seeing a simple, sturdy cabin, smoke curling from its chimney. They spoke of catching a glimpse of a woman in a pink dress tending a garden of impossible green, or an elderly woman sitting peacefully in the sun. And they spoke of the mountain man, Jedediah, seen not as a wild, solitary creature, but as a protector, a husband, a son. His legend was no longer one of savagery and isolation, but of honor and redemption. Up on the mountain, the world below was a distant concern. Leanne and Jedediah had built a life from the ashes of her humiliation. Their love, born in silence and nurtured by kindness, had blossomed like the wildflowers he brought her. One evening, standing at the edge of their clearing, they looked out as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Aunt May sat on the bench, humming softly. Jedediah's arm was a warm, solid weight around Leanne's shoulders. He was her home. This mountain was her home. She had come seeking a life and had found something infinitely more profound, a love as vast and unyielding as the wilderness itself. Their story became a quiet truth whispered on the wind, a reminder that true wealth is not measured in gold or property, but in the courage to offer a hand to the fallen, and that the grandest of homes can be built from the simple, powerful words, "There is room." Remember that in a world full of noise and cruelty, the quietest acts of decency can echo the loudest. If their story of redemption moved you, consider sharing it, and keep seeking out the tales that remind us of the strength and beauty of the human heart.